Put them down or I'll scream so loud the whole block will hear. The two men froze, turning toward the rusted gate at the edge of the landfill. What they saw made them hesitate for just a second. Standing there was Grace Turner, thin and tall, her rain-soaked dress clinging to her frame, her hair wild in the night wind, and in her trembling hand, nothing more than a broken broomstick she had snatched from her porch. Her shoes were worn flat, her hands raw from years of scrubbing floors, but her eyes, sharp, unyielding, did not waver. One of the kidnappers, thick-necked and sneering, barked a laugh. "You serious? Look at this maid thinks she's some kind of hero." His partner smirked, shining his flashlight directly at her face. "Step aside, lady. These kids ain't yours." But Grace didn't move. Behind her legs, Ethan and Caleb clung tight, their small bodies shaking, their eyes darting between the men and the woman shielding them. For years she had been invisible, just another poor woman at the edge of Houston. But in that moment, she stood taller than the city's tallest towers because she was the only line between innocence and cruelty. Support us by subscribing and share in the comments. Where are you listening to this story of resilience tonight? The late afternoon sun hung low over the sprawling city of Houston, casting long amber streaks across a horizon already bruised by clouds gathering for an evening storm. The air was heavy with moisture, sticky against the skin, promising rain that had not yet come. Downtown shimmered with glass towers and traffic noise, but further out, past the suburbs with their neat lawns and cul-de-sacs, the road stretched into the forgotten outskirts, where warehouses stood hollow and weeds crawled up rusted fences. It was here, along one such road, that an old Chevy Suburban rattled uneasily, its paint chipped, its muffler groaning like a sick animal with each bump. Inside the back seat sat two boys, Ethan and Caleb, identical twins barely 6 years old. Their small frames were pressed close together, as though contact with each other alone could anchor them in a world suddenly terrifying and strange. They wore matching red cotton t-shirts that still carried the faint scent of fabric softener, as if they had been dressed in haste without time to soil them with play. Their shorts' denim cutoffs were frayed at the hem, brushing against knees scraped raw from being dragged into the car earlier that day. Each boy's shoes were slightly too large, clearly tied by hands that had no patience for children, and one of Caleb's shoelaces trailed untied like a loose thread of his fate. Ethan was the more defiant of the two, though fear clouded his wide gray-blue eyes. His hair, chestnut brown and slightly wavy, stuck damply to his forehead with sweat. He had always been the one to speak first, to ask questions his teachers admired and his nanny sometimes grew weary of. Caleb, by contrast, was quieter, a softer reflection of his twin. His eyes were darker, more solemn, and though he looked nearly identical to Ethan, there was a gentleness in the way he clutched his brother's sleeve now, a plea for reassurance. Their bond had been forged in 6 short years of shared secrets, whispered stories under blankets, and inseparable laughter. But today that bond was tested against terror itself. The front of the car smelled of stale cigarettes and motor oil. At the wheel sat a man known among his kind only as Dale Red Kessler, though no one had spoken his name aloud in the boy's presence. Dale was a hulking figure in his late 40s, his red beard shot with gray, his face pitted from years of bar fights and poor hygiene. Tattoos of skulls and daggers crawled up his forearms, barely visible beneath a greasy denim jacket. Once, long ago, Dale had been a mechanic, a decent one at that, but his drinking and temper had cost him everything. Now he worked dirty jobs for quick cash, and kidnapping paid well if you had the stomach for it. He had the stomach. Beside him in the passenger seat lounged Miguel "Mick" Alvarez, younger by a decade, wiry with restless energy. His black hair was slicked back with cheap gel, and his narrow face carried the cocky grin of a man who thought himself cleverer than he was. A gold chain glinted at his throat, a souvenir from a cousin who once ran with gangs in El Paso. Mick fancied himself the brains of the operation, though it was Dale who carried the muscle. Between them, silence reigned, punctuated only by the occasional curse when the Chevy jolted over a pothole. From the back seat, Ethan dared to whisper, "Where are we going?" His voice trembled, almost lost under the groan of the engine. Mick turned, his grin suddenly sharp. "Shut up, kid. You'll find out soon enough." His tone was casual, but his eyes carried no kindness. Caleb pressed closer to his brother, his small hand squeezing Ethan's. Up ahead, the flashing red and blue lights of a police checkpoint suddenly pierced the dusky road. Dale spat a curse, his grip tightening on the wheel. "Shit, we can't go through that." Mick straightened, panic edging into his swagger. "Just drive past, act normal." "No," Dale barked, cutting him off. His instincts, honed by years of running from cops, screamed otherwise. Slamming the wheel to the right, he veered off the main road, tires spitting gravel as the Suburban lurched onto a dirt track that led away from the city lights. The boys were thrown against the door, their cries stifled by the roar of the engine. The dirt road ended in a vast expanse of the county landfill, a graveyard of discarded furniture, rusting appliances, and mountains of rotting garbage. The stench hit like a physical blow, sour and acrid, laced with smoke from a distant burn pit. Swarms of flies buzzed lazily in the thick air. It was a place where the city's wealth went to die, where yesterday's luxuries became today's refuse. Dale braked hard, dust rising in choking clouds. "Out!" he snarled. He yanked open the back door and dragged Ethan by the arm, shoving him onto the damp earth. Caleb stumbled after, tears streaking the dirt on his cheeks. Mick glanced nervously at the road behind them. "We're just leaving them here? What if they'll keep quiet? They're too scared. We don't have time," Dale growled. He shoved Caleb down beside his brother, then slammed the door shut. The Suburban roared away, its taillights dwindling until the boys were left with only silence, the smell of rot, and the oppressive weight of the coming storm. For a long moment, Ethan and Caleb didn't move. Then, trembling, Caleb whispered, "What do we do?" Ethan, his lip trembling, forced himself to stand. He brushed dirt from his shorts, though it clung stubbornly. We have to find food. We have to stay alive." His voice was shaky, but there was steel in it too. Together, the twins began sifting through the refuse, their small hands brushing against broken bottles, bent spoons, half-molded bread. Each discovery was a desperate hope, quickly dashed. A soggy cracker became a treasure, shared between them with solemn ceremony. As the first drops of rain finally began to fall, mixing with the sweat and tears on their faces, the twins huddled together under the skeletal frame of an abandoned shopping cart, waiting for night. Far across the city, in the glittering heart of Houston, a very different scene unfolded. In a mansion lined with marble floors and crystal chandeliers, Alexander Monroe stood by the tall windows of his study, fists clenched white around a glass of bourbon he had not touched. At 54, Alexander was still imposing, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver streaks dignifying his once black hair. His sharp jawline and hawk-like nose gave him an air of command, one that had served him well in boardrooms and negotiations. Yet tonight, his gray eyes were bloodshot, wild with fear. Alexander had built his fortune in real estate, buying swaths of derelict land and erecting skyscrapers where others had seen only decay. He was a man accustomed to control, to bending markets and people alike to his will. But the disappearance of his twin sons unraveled him in ways no financial crisis ever had. He paced the room like a caged beast, his voice hoarse as he barked orders into the phone. "Not a word to the press. Not yet. We will handle this quietly. I don't care what it costs." Seated across from him, sipping whiskey with unnerving calm, was Richard Hale, his chief financial officer and confidant of over 20 years. Richard was a man in his late 50s, lean where Alexander was broad, his thinning blonde hair combed neatly, his tailored suit immaculate. His pale blue eyes held a calculating glint, one that had often helped Alexander turn impossible deals into victories. To outsiders, he was the perfect ally, methodical, loyal, indispensable. But tonight, as Alexander raged, Richard's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles when his employer turned away. For Richard, the disappearance of Ethan and Caleb was not tragedy, but opportunity. The storm that had threatened all evening finally broke over Houston, and by the time the sun sank into the horizon, the city was drenched in sheets of rain. Downtown skyscrapers glistened under the heavy downpour, their mirrored sides fractured by lightning flashes, while traffic struggled through flooded intersections. Out on the far edge of the city, where neon lights faded and the streets dissolved into cracked pavement and open lots, the rain turned dirt into rivers of mud that ran down toward the landfill like tributaries feeding a poisoned sea. Here, in a small wooden shack with peeling paint and a sagging roof patched with tar paper, lived Grace Turner, a woman who had long grown accustomed to storms. Grace was 35 years old, tall and thin, her frame wiry from years of physical labor. Her skin was a deep shade of mahogany, her cheekbones sharp, her eyes large and expressive beneath a curtain of tight curls that had once been black but now bore threads of early gray. Life had not been kind to her. Her father had died in a factory fire when she was only 10, and her mother, left with 4 children, had struggled to keep food on the table. Grace had grown up quickly, often playing the role of caretaker rather than child, and it had instilled in her a natural instinct to protect others even at her own expense. Her voice was soft, her manner patient, but beneath that gentleness lay resilience hardened like iron by disappointment after disappointment. She had once worked as a housemaid in wealthier parts of Houston, scrubbing floors and cooking meals for families who barely acknowledged her existence. But after being dismissed without cause from one such position, she had drifted into the edges of the city, finding shelter near the landfill where rent was cheap and expectations were few. Despite her poverty, she had a reputation in the neighborhood for helping stray animals and offering food to children who went hungry. That evening, as rain hammered against her tin roof, Grace wrapped herself in a thin raincoat and stepped outside carrying 2 heavy buckets toward the community pump. The sky glowed violet with fading daylight, and the air smelled of wet earth and garbage. She hummed softly to herself, the melody and old hymn her mother used to sing when life seemed unbearable. As she rounded a pile of rusting metal sheets at the edge of the landfill, her humming caught in her throat. 2 small figures were crouched beside a dented oil drum, their hands rifling desperately through soggy refuse. At first, Grace thought they were the Jenkins boys, a pair of local brothers who often scavenged for bottles to sell. But as she stepped closer, her heart clenched. These were not children of the neighborhood. Their clothes, though muddied, were intact, their shoes too new for the landfill's regulars. One boy's shirt was torn at the hem, revealing pale skin scratched by brambles, while the other clutched a half-eaten piece of bread as though it were gold. Their faces, under the weak light of a flickering street lamp, were delicate and refined, features that spoke not of hunger's legacy, but of sudden misfortune. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Grace's voice, though gentle, carried across the rain. The taller of the two, Ethan, snapped his head up, his gray-blue eyes wide with terror. He pulled his brother Caleb close, shielding him with a fierceness far older than his 6 years. Caleb's darker eyes welled with tears, but he said nothing, burying his face in Ethan's damp shirt. Grace stopped a few feet away, not wanting to startle them further. She noticed the cuts on their knees, fresh and bleeding, the dirt embedded under their fingernails, and yet oddly, the softness of their hands remained. These were not children accustomed to scavenging. They belonged somewhere else, somewhere far away from the stench of rot. Grace slowly set down her buckets. "I won't hurt you," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above the rain. "Are you lost? Do you have family nearby?" Neither boy answered. Ethan's gaze darted past her, scanning the shadows as if expecting the men who had abandoned them to return. Grace felt a pang of recognition in that look she had worn it herself, years ago, the night her father never came home from the factory. She knelt on the muddy ground, ignoring how it soaked into her clothes. "It's all right," she whispered. "You're safe now." Thunder cracked overhead, and Caleb flinched violently. Ethan wrapped both arms around his twin, whispering something inaudible, his lips trembling. Grace reached into her coat pocket and drew out a small piece of cornbread she had saved from supper. She extended it, palm open. "Here. You must be hungry." For a long moment, the boys stared. Then, hesitantly, Ethan took the bread, broke it in half, and gave the larger portion to his brother. They ate in silence, chewing slowly, their eyes never leaving her face. Grace exhaled, a mixture of relief and sorrow. Whoever these boys were, they were not meant to be here, not meant to survive by clawing through garbage. She made a decision then, an instinctive, dangerous decision, that she could not leave them to this fate. She gathered her buckets again and stood. "Come with me," she said softly. "My house is not far. You'll be warm. You'll have food." The boys exchanged glances. Ethan shook his head, wary, but Caleb tugged at his sleeve, whispering a single word Grace could barely hear. "Please." After a pause, Ethan nodded. Grace smiled gently, extending her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Caleb slipped his small fingers into hers. Across the city, the storm seemed to rattle the very windows of Alexander Monroe's mansion. He stood in the study once more, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound books and a roaring fire he did not feel. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his tie discarded, his normally composed image unraveling by the hour. He barked orders into his phone, his voice rising. "Find them! Do whatever it takes. Hire whoever you must." At his side stood Richard Hale, ever the picture of composure. His thin lips curved in a sympathetic line, his pale blue eyes watching Alexander with the detachment of a man studying a chessboard. Richard had arranged for private investigators men he himself had chosen to comb the city. He made certain their leads went nowhere, their reports muddled, their progress stalled. Each time Alexander demanded answers, Richard shook his head gravely, murmuring about the cunning of criminals and the difficulties of tracing ghosts. All the while, he tightened his hold on Monroe's empire, knowing that every hour the twins remained missing was another brick loosened from Alexander's fortress of power. "Don't worry," Richard said now, his voice velvet smooth. "We'll find them. But these things take time. The men I've hired are the best." He omitted the truth that he had hired them not to find but to delay. Alexander slammed a fist onto his desk, rattling a silver-framed photo of Ethan and Caleb smiling on a sunny beach. "Time is the one thing I don't have, Richard. If they're not found soon." His voice broke, something rare and terrible, a chink in the armor of a man who had built skyscrapers from nothing. He turned toward the window, hiding his tears. Richard's gaze lingered on the photo, then shifted back to Alexander's trembling shoulders. In that moment, his faint smile returned, invisible to the man whose empire he intended to claim. Grace pushed open the warped wooden door of her shack with her hip, balancing two dripping children in her arms and the weight of a decision she had not yet admitted to herself. The storm had ended, but the night air was damp and cold, smelling of wet garbage and rust. Inside, the one-room house was dimly lit by a single lamp whose shade was patched with tape. The furniture was sparse: an old iron bed with a thin mattress, a crooked table with two mismatched chairs, and a stove that hissed whenever she coaxed it to life. A calico cat named Mabel, plump and aging at nearly 12 years old, lifted her head from a corner where she had curled. Mabel had been Grace's companion for years, her mottled fur a patchwork of orange, white, and black, her eyes pale green and suspicious of strangers. She hissed softly at the boys before settling again, as if deciding they were too small to pose a threat. Grace set the twins on the bed and busied herself fetching water from a tin basin. She scrubbed their scraped knees with gentle hands, wincing at their sharp intakes of breath. Ethan resisted at first, jaw clenched, but eventually surrendered to her care. Caleb, more pliant, leaned into the touch, though his eyes stayed wary. Grace warmed a small pot of milk on the stove, the smell filling the shack with a rare comfort. She placed 2 chipped cups before them along with slices of hard bread she had saved. The children devoured the food quickly, as though afraid it might vanish if they didn't eat fast enough. For the first time since she had seen them, Grace allowed herself a closer look. Ethan's features, sharper than his brother's, carried a stubborn determination. Caleb's softness was his counterpoint, his dark eyes reflecting a kind of vulnerability that made Grace's chest ache. They were inseparable, like two halves of one soul, and even now, in a strange home, they sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering to each other between bites of bread. Grace leaned back, exhaustion pressing against her ribs. She thought of the neighborhood gossip, of the children abandoned by mothers chasing new lovers, of fathers who disappeared into prison or addiction. But these boys were different. Their clothes were too fine, their speech too clear, their manners instinctively polite. She could not reconcile their presence here with the harsh lives of the children she usually saw around the landfill. That night, long after the boys had curled under a patchwork quilt, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, watching their even breaths. Her mind churned. Where had they come from? Who had abandoned them, and why? She remembered the fear in Ethan's eyes, the way Caleb clung to him, and felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavier than the storm clouds had. By dawn, the shack smelled faintly of coffee, weak and watered down, but warm. Grace stirred at the stove while the boys played quietly on the dirt floor with a few bottle caps and bits of string. She smiled despite herself. Even in squalor, children found ways to create worlds. Her routine was broken when her neighbor, Clara Jenkins, tapped on the doorframe. Clara was a woman in her late 40s, broad-shouldered and perpetually flushed from heat or drink, with coarse brown hair tied in a kerchief. She was known for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, always prying into others' affairs. She stepped inside without waiting, her eyes immediately falling on the boys. "New company, Grace?" Clara asked, voice dripping with insinuation. Grace stiffened. "Just helping out for a while." Clara shrugged but lingered, her gaze critical. "Be careful. Strays have a way of bringing trouble." She left soon after, but her curiosity would surely spread through whispers before the day was done. Grace sighed, knowing secrecy was fragile in a place where gossip was the only entertainment. Later that afternoon, while washing dishes in a plastic basin, Grace reached for the battered radio perched on a shelf. She twisted the dial, static giving way to the low voice of a news anchor. She often listened while working, a way to stay tethered to the larger world. Today, however, the voice carried an urgency that made her pause. Breaking update on the Monroe kidnapping case. The twin sons of billionaire Alexander Monroe, Ethan and Caleb, remain missing after 3 days. Authorities believe foul play is involved. Grace froze, the plate slipping from her hands into the water. She turned slowly toward the boys, who were chasing Mabel in circles, laughing for the first time since she had seen them. Her pulse thundered. She snatched the knob on the radio, increasing the volume. On the screen of her small, dust-covered television rarely used except for weather reports, the news station replayed the same story. 2 photographs appeared, identical boys smiling on a sunny lawn wearing matching red shirts. Grace's knees went weak. She sank into the nearest chair, her spoon clattering to the floor. It was them. There was no mistaking it. The children in her shack were the missing heirs of Alexander Monroe. Her mind spun. The Monroes were untouchable, their faces appearing in business journals and society pages alike. She remembered once cleaning a mansion where guests had spoken admiringly of Alexander's ruthlessness, how he had carved an empire from ruin. That these boys, his boys, now sat cross-legged on her floor, eating breadcrumbs and petting her cat, seemed impossible. Grace's first instinct was to call the police, but fear clamped down. She knew what happened when the authorities got involved. Children were whisked into foster systems, shuffled like papers on a desk, their fates decided by strangers. Would they ever return to their father, or would bureaucracy swallow them? And what if the men who had abandoned them came back? Her shack was no fortress. That night she lay awake, staring at the sagging ceiling. Every creak of the boards outside made her flinch. She imagined headlights cutting through the dark, men's voices barking orders, the boys torn from her arms. She turned and saw them curled together on her bed, safe for now, and her throat tightened. She could not let them be lost again. In the Monroe mansion, the world was unraveling. Alexander stood before a bank of cameras, his jaw set, his voice hoarse as he read a prepared statement. The press clamored for answers, but he gave them none, offering only promises of cooperation and pleas for privacy. His gray suit hung loose as though he had aged 10 years in as many days. Behind him, unseen by the flashing cameras, Richard Hale orchestrated chaos. He had arranged for anonymous calls to flood the Monroe estate, some demanding ransom, others claiming sightings that led nowhere. Each call tightened the noose of despair around Alexander's heart. Richard watched with satisfaction as his old friend crumbled, the once imperious billionaire reduced to a desperate father. Every sleepless night, every false lead, brought Alexander closer to the breaking point. In private, Alexander replayed memories of his sons, their laughter echoing down marble hallways, the way they raced through gardens, their innocent questions at the dinner table. Now those halls were silent, their absence a weight pressing down on him. He poured glass after glass of bourbon, but found no comfort. He had built skyscrapers that touched the clouds, yet he could not find his children. And still, Richard smiled, careful to hide it behind sympathetic words. "We'll find them, Alex. We just need patience." Patience was the one thing Alexander no longer had. The days that followed were heavy with unease, as if the storm had never truly ended but lingered invisibly in the air. Grace Turner moved through her meager routines with the caution of someone who knew the ground beneath her could split open at any moment. Rumors had begun to circulate in the neighborhood. Clara Jenkins' sharp tongue had spread the sighting of two unfamiliar boys, and Grace could feel the weight of watchful eyes whenever she stepped outside. The children clung to her whenever strangers passed. Ethan had grown protective, watching windows and doors as though he expected danger at every corner. His young face, still soft with childhood, now bore an expression too serious for a boy his age. Caleb remained gentler but carried a constant tremor in his hands, often burying his face against Grace's side when footsteps approached. Grace herself barely slept. Each creak of the shack, each bark of a stray dog outside jolted her awake, heart racing. On the fourth night, the air was strangely still. The storm clouds had rolled back, leaving a pale, washed-out moon hanging over the landfill. Grace stepped outside to hang damp laundry on a line stretched between two leaning poles. The smell of rot from the landfill drifted across the night air, mixing with the faint scent of detergent. She was humming softly, trying to soothe her own nerves, when she froze. There it was, a sound different from the usual scurrying rats or the clank of settling metal. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, crunching across gravel. Her blood turned cold. She strained her ears. Then came the sweep of a flashlight beam, cutting through the cracks of her shack's wall. Someone was out there, someone searching. Grace's instincts surged. She darted inside, whispering sharply to the boys. "Ethan, Caleb, quiet now, we have to go." Ethan grabbed his brother's hand without hesitation, his eyes wide but determined. Caleb whimpered but obeyed. Grace pushed open the back door, ushering them into the labyrinth of scrap metal and discarded appliances that sprawled behind her home. The footsteps grew louder. A rough voice muttered curses in the darkness. Another beam of light joined the first. There was more than one. Grace's pulse thundered as she led the boys through narrow gaps between piles of rusted washing machines and mountains of crushed cans. The metal groaned and clattered around them as their feet slipped in the mud. Behind, their pursuers gave chase. Boots pounded, heavy and relentless. "They went this way," one shouted. A crash followed as someone knocked over a barrel. The sound echoed, metallic and terrifying. Caleb stumbled, falling hard onto his knees with a cry. Ethan yanked him up, tears streaming down his cheeks from the effort. "Come on, Caleb! Don't stop!" Grace pulled both boys close, half dragging them forward. Her breath tore through her chest. They wove through the maze of containers, their shadows stretched grotesque by the swaying beams of flashlights. Every turn seemed to lead deeper into the scrapyard's belly, until at last Grace skidded to a stop. A wall of corrugated steel loomed before them, too high to climb, slick with rust and rainwater. Behind them, footsteps closed in. From the shadows, a figure emerged. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath a hood and scarf. His presence was suffocating, his voice gravelly and low when he spoke. "Give me the kids, lady, and you walk away alive." Grace's knees shook, but she stepped forward, arms spread protectively in front of the boys. Her voice wavered, yet carried steel. "You'll have to go through me first." Ethan clutched her coat, Caleb whimpered, and the man laughed darkly, advancing. Then, sharp, commanding another voice cut through the night. "Police!" "Step away from them." A gunshot cracked the air, echoing off the steel walls. The hooded man flinched, dropping his flashlight. The beam swung wildly, illuminating a young police officer striding into the alley, gun raised. This was Officer Ryan Carter, 26 years old, uniform damp with sweat and dust. His build was lean but strong, his posture steady with the training of a man who had seen danger before. Ryan's hair was a sun-streaked brown, cropped close, his eyes a piercing hazel that scanned the scene with focused intensity. His jaw was set, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. Ryan had grown up only a few blocks away from where Grace now lived. As a boy, he had known hunger too. His father, a dock worker, had died in an accident, leaving Ryan's mother to struggle. Ryan remembered nights when there was no dinner, only the quiet kindness of neighbors like Grace, who had slipped food into his hands when she thought no one was watching. That memory had stayed with him through the academy, a reminder of why he had chosen the badge. Now, that same woman stood before him, shielding two frightened children from danger. The hooded man snarled and lunged. Ryan fired another warning shot, sparks leaping from a metal drum. The man froze, then spun to flee. But one of his accomplices, smaller and quicker, stumbled directly into Ryan's path. Ryan tackled him with practiced ease, forcing the man to the ground, cuffs snapping around his wrists. The captured thug cursed and writhed, his greasy hair plastered to his forehead. The others scattered, melting into the shadows of the landfill. Their footsteps faded until the night swallowed them whole. For a long moment, silence reigned. Grace clutched Ethan and Caleb to her chest, shaking with relief and exhaustion. Ryan straightened, his breathing heavy, eyes scanning to ensure no other threats lingered. He holstered his weapon, then turned to Grace. "Are you all right?" Grace managed a nod, though her lips trembled. They wanted the boys." Ryan's gaze dropped to Ethan and Caleb. The twins stared back, wide-eyed, their faces pale in the moonlight. He frowned, suspicion flickering in his expression, but he said nothing yet. Instead, he helped Grace guide the children away from the steel wall, back toward the safety of her shack. The laundry she had left hanging earlier fluttered in tatters, forgotten. Behind them, the arrested man groaned, already awaiting the long ride to a holding cell. But the shadows still lingered. The threat had not ended. The police station in East Houston was a building that had seen better days. Its faded brick walls bore the scars of decades of storms, and its flickering fluorescent lights hummed with weary persistence. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old coffee, disinfectant, and damp paper files. It was past midnight when Grace Turner, exhausted and pale, sat stiffly on a metal chair in one of the interview rooms. Ethan and Caleb huddled together beside her, their small hands clenched so tightly that their knuckles were white. Across from them stood Officer Ryan Carter, still in his uniform, the dampness of his collar from the chase at the landfill not yet dried. He had shed the hardened demeanor of the officer on duty, and now carried the careful patience of someone who knew fear when he saw it. His hazel eyes flicked between Grace and the boys, a mixture of concern and recognition stirring within him. "Grace," he said softly, pulling up a chair to sit across from her, "you need to tell me everything. I can protect you, but only if I know the truth." Grace's lips trembled. She had lived her life avoiding the kind of men who asked questions in uniforms, but Ryan was different. She remembered him as a boy, lanky and half-starved, hanging around her porch when his mother worked double shifts. She had slipped him biscuits, told him stories to keep his mind busy, and watched him grow into a young man determined to wear the badge. That memory steadied her now. She nodded, swallowing hard, and began. "I found them near the landfill. They were searching for food. I thought they were strays at first, but I knew something wasn't right. Their clothes, their faces, these weren't children from the neighborhood. I brought them home, gave them food, and then I saw them on the news." She paused, her voice cracking. "They're Alexander Monroe's sons, aren't they?" Ryan leaned back, exhaling slowly. He had suspected, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through him. "Yes, they are." The twins flinched at the mention of their father's name, Caleb pressing his face into Ethan's shoulder. Ethan spoke for the first time, his voice small but clear. "The bad men. They said Daddy wouldn't pay if they hurt us." His words hung in the air like broken glass. Ryan's jaw tightened. He excused himself briefly, stepping into the hallway where the old walls echoed with typewriter clacks and distant phones. He approached a cluttered desk manned by Detective Linda Chavez, a woman in her late 40s with sharp features and dark hair pulled into a severe bun. Linda was known among her colleagues as relentless. Her eyes missed nothing, her files were always immaculate, and she had a reputation for dragging the truth into the light no matter how much it resisted. Life had carved her into steel after losing her husband in a robbery gone wrong 15 years earlier. Since then, her work had been her anchor. Ryan explained quickly, and Linda's eyes narrowed. She tapped furiously on her keyboard, pulling up case files, ransom calls, financial records. "There's a pattern here," she murmured. "The kidnappers weren't sophisticated enough to plan this alone. Someone financed them. Someone close enough to know Monroe's movements." Hours later, as dawn's gray light seeped through the blinds, Linda looked up from the reports, her face grim. "It's him. Richard Hale, financial officer. He's been siphoning money through shell accounts, the same ones that wired payments to the kidnappers. He's using the boys to force Alexander into concessions." Ryan swore under his breath. He had met Richard at charity galas, always immaculately dressed, his handshake cold. The idea that the man could orchestrate such cruelty made his stomach turn. Meanwhile, at the Monroe estate, Alexander stood alone in his office. The city skyline spread before him like a kingdom he no longer recognized. His once imposing figure was slumped, his tie loosened, his silver hair unkempt. He had been awake for days, fueled by anger, grief, and too much bourbon. The phone on his desk rang constantly. Investigators, reporters, false ransom demands. Each one carved another piece from his resolve. When Ryan's call finally came, Alexander's hand trembled as he picked up the receiver. The words poured through. "Your sons are alive. They were found. Richard Hale is behind this." Silence followed. Then, a sound no one in his empire had ever heard. Alexander Monroe choked on his own breath, knees nearly buckling. Richard, the man he had trusted with his finances, his company, his confidence for over 2 decades, had betrayed him. The realization was a blade to the chest. Memories crashed in. The long nights of strategy meetings with Richard at his side, the holidays where Richard had been seated at his table, the advice he had leaned on during crises. All of it, poisoned. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window, staring at the skyline he had built, and realizing how meaningless it was if his sons had been lost forever. Hours later, Alexander was escorted to the station. When he entered the interview room, Grace rose instinctively, ready to defend the boys. Ethan and Caleb leapt from their seats, running into their father's arms, sobbing with relief. Alexander clutched them so tightly it seemed he would never let go. Tears streaked down his weathered face. The stoicism of the empire builder shattered. When his eyes finally lifted, they met Grace's. For a moment, he could not speak. Then, voice hoarse, he whispered, "You saved them. I can never repay this." Grace shook her head, her hands trembling. "I only did what anyone would do." But Alexander knew better. Not anyone would risk their life against kidnappers or feed strangers with the last of their bread. Not anyone would choose compassion over fear. He crossed the room, towering over her, but instead of the commanding figure known to the world, he was simply a father. He took her hands in his, and to the astonishment of Ryan, Linda, and every officer present, Alexander Monroe wept openly. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for giving me back my sons." The morning broke with a brilliance that felt almost cruel after weeks of storms. The sky over Houston was a clear, unbroken blue, the kind of sky that seemed to declare renewal whether or not the people beneath it were ready. Outside the Monroe estate, a mansion sprawling across manicured lawns and guarded gates, a sea of reporters gathered. Camera flashes burst like lightning. Microphones jostled for space, and voices rose in a cacophony of speculation. The kidnapping of Ethan and Caleb Monroe had gripped the entire nation, and now that the boys had been found, the world demanded to see them. Inside, the atmosphere was taut with expectation. Alexander Monroe paced the grand foyer, his polished shoes tapping against marble tiles. His silver hair was neatly combed again, his tailored suit pressed, but his eyes still bore the exhaustion of sleepless nights. Today was not about empire or reputation. It was about presenting to the world what he had almost lost. The heavy doors opened, and Grace Turner stepped in, her posture tentative, her eyes darting at the chandeliers and oil paintings that dwarfed her presence. She wore a simple blue dress borrowed from a neighbor, ironed carefully despite the frayed hem. Her mahogany skin glowed in the morning light, and her tight curls had been brushed back, though strands rebelled at the edges. She was no socialite, no guest accustomed to halls of power, but she carried with her the quiet dignity of a woman who had endured storms greater than any gilded room could imagine. At her sides clung Ethan and Caleb, each holding one of her hands as if afraid she might disappear. Ethan's chin was raised with a bravery beyond his years, but his grip was fierce. Caleb, the gentler of the two, clutched Grace with tears brimming, his voice barely a whisper. "We want to stay with her." The words struck Alexander like a blow. He had prepared for their reunion, had envisioned their laughter filling the mansion again, but he had not expected their loyalty to this woman. Grace had sheltered them in filth and fear, yet they looked at her with an affection that money could not buy. For a long moment, he could not speak. Then, with a heavy breath, he walked forward. Before the barrage of cameras outside, Alexander placed his arm firmly around Grace's shoulders. His voice, broadcast live, carried the weight of a man humbled. "This woman saved my children. She gave them food when they were starving, protection when they were hunted, and love when the world abandoned them. No fortune I possess could equal what she has given me. From this day forward, she is family." The crowd erupted, reporters shouting questions, cameras snapping. Grace's eyes widened, her throat tightening, but she said nothing. Alexander continued, his gaze shifting toward the lenses that would carry his words to millions. "And more than that, I vow to honor her courage by helping those who live where she lives. The neighborhood that sheltered my sons will no longer be forgotten. I will rebuild it homes, schools, safety, so that no child has to search through garbage to survive." Behind the flashing lights, Ryan Carter stood in uniform, shoulders squared, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. He had been summoned to the estate not only as part of security, but as a symbol of the department's success. His hazel eyes scanned the crowd, landing briefly on Grace. He gave her a small nod, a silent reminder of the boy he had once been, the boy she had fed when no one else cared. For Ryan, today was more than ceremony. It was vindication that compassion and justice could intersect. Later, in the mansion's great hall, the formal press conference concluded. The twins were led upstairs by their father's staff, but not without glancing back to ensure Grace was still near. Alexander, now free of cameras, turned to Ryan. "Officer Carter, you will be commended for your bravery. I intend to speak personally to the chief. Your career should reflect what you've done here." Ryan flushed, his jaw tightening to contain his pride. "I only did my job, sir." "Perhaps," Alexander said quietly, "but you also repaid a debt of kindness in the darkest of nights. That is no small thing." At that moment, U.S. Marshal Thomas Greer entered, a tall man in his early 50s with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes. Greer was known for dismantling organized crime rings with a ruthlessness matched only by his integrity. His salt-and-pepper hair was cropped short, and a scar above his eyebrow gave him the appearance of a man who had seen more battles than most survived. Today he carried a file thick with evidence. "It's done," Greer announced, his voice gravelly from years of barking orders. Richard Hale has been taken into custody. Wire transfers, shell accounts, statements from the thugs we caught, everything points to him as the mastermind. Alexander's jaw tightened, grief and fury wrestling in his eyes. "Richard," he whispered, almost to himself. The name tasted like ash. For decades he had trusted that man with not only his fortune, but his life. And now, betrayal had come from closest quarters. Grace watched from the side, unsure whether to step forward or remain invisible. She could see in Alexander not the titan of business, but a father stripped raw. His silver hair gleamed under the chandeliers, but his shoulders seemed heavier than marble columns. For all his power, he was fragile, and it startled her. The day moved quickly after that. Reporters spread the story: the betrayal of Richard Hale, the bravery of Officer Ryan Carter, the resilience of a woman named Grace Turner. Neighbors in the landfill district gathered around borrowed televisions, cheering through tears. Clara Jenkins, the nosy neighbor, crossed herself and muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Even Mabel the cat, curled on Grace's cot, yawned as though unimpressed, her whiskers twitching with the scent of something better to come. By evening, the mansion was quieter. Ethan and Caleb sat on a rug in their room, playing with toys that once had seemed like treasures but now paled in comparison to the threadbare quilt they had shared with Grace. They called her name when she appeared in the doorway, their faces lighting up. Grace knelt, brushing their hair back, whispering that she would never leave them, even if her world and theirs did not always fit together. Alexander watched from the hall, his heart swelling with something unfamiliar humility. For all his skyscrapers, for all his boardroom victories, this moment taught him what mattered. He stepped forward, not as a magnet, but as a man. "Grace," he said softly, "they need you. And maybe I do too." She met his eyes, uncertain, overwhelmed, but she nodded. In that nod lay the quiet triumph of a woman who had once been invisible, now standing in the light, not because she sought it, but because she had chosen love when others chose fear. In the end, this story is not only about Ethan, Caleb, Grace, or Alexander. It is a reminder for all of us. Sometimes the true heroes are not the ones with power, money, or weapons, but those who choose love, compassion, and courage when the world seems dark. In our daily lives, we may not face kidnappers or betrayal, but we do face choices, whether to care for someone in need, whether to stand up for what is right, whether to give kindness when it is easier to walk away. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of light in the darkness. And above all, let us pray together. May God bless and protect you and your families, just as He guided Grace to protect the children. If you believe in the power of faith, write one simple word in the comments: Amen.